This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so in today's session, we will try to understand regarding first constructors concept. For the time being, if I will explain you one more concept. In yesterday's session, I mean day 5 session, we already had a great discussion on top of two concepts. One is operators and flow control statements. And for each and every concept or operator and then flow control statement, we see the demo examples also. And now in today's session, we'll try to understand the concept of or benefit of using constructors. What do you mean by constructor and all these things? Please try to understand. First of all, before constructor, I wanted to ask one question. What do you mean by object? Immediately, your answer is instance of a class is known as object. Okay, what do you mean by instance? As we already discussed, to allocate or to create the enough sufficient memory space for all the properties of the class, especially, to be honest speaking, for all the properties or for only the instance properties. For instance properties, non-static properties of the class. That is the meaning of what? Instance. For the static properties, memory will be created at the time of the class loading. Okay, so that is why to create the memory for static properties, we don't require any object. Only object is required for the non-static properties to allocate the memory spaces. That is the meaning of object. But what is the syntax? What is the syntax to create the object? Here, class name followed by object name followed by new followed by class name, open parenthesis, and then closed parenthesis. Okay, class, 1 second. Right, sir. So syntax is to create the object is class name, object name equals to new followed by class name. For example, if my class name is student, I am creating the object like this, as we have already seen the examples. If you are understanding, student is the name of the class, obj is the name of the object, new is the dynamic memory allocation operator, and the last one is what? Student open parenthesis, closure parenthesis. If anything preceded with open parenthesis and then closure parenthesis, usually we can call it as what? Method. If anything preceded or followed by open parenthesis and then closed parenthesis, usually we can consider that one as a method. But this is not only a method, this is not a normal method. Some special feature is there. What is this special feature? This method is exactly equivalent or similar to what? Class name. So what do you mean by constructor? Constructor is a special member method. Why it is a special member method? Because of the method name, I mean the constructor name and the class name must be always same. That is the rule. Constructor name and the class name always must be same. And one more rule is there. Constructor should not return anything. Constructor should not return anything, even void also. Usually, if a method is not returning anything, we are going to specify void as the return type. But in case of constructor, we should not return anything, even void also. So these are the two rules we have to follow. Otherwise, if you are not following, those methods will become like a normal member methods. Okay. So what is the main purpose? Purpose you need to understand. We can understand while we are defining the constructor, what are the rules we have to follow. Constructor name always must be similar to class name. That is the first rule I have to follow. What is the second rule? While we are defining the constructor, I should not return anything. Even void also you should not mention. If you are mentioning void, it will become like a normal method. It will become a normal method. One second. Right. So what is the purpose of the constructor? Purpose of the constructor is to initialize the object. To initialize the object. Yes. You may not understand the point which I am writing here, which I wrote here, to initialize the object. So what do you mean by initialization? What do you mean by initializing the object? See, initialization is nothing but what? Assigning the values. Isn't it right? Initialization is nothing but what? Assigning the values. That is the whole meaning of what? Initialization. So what we are initializing? We are initializing the object. That is the core purpose of what? Constructor. Yes, I'll tell you, I'll show you also whether it is really initializing the object or not. Just by seeing this example, you will get the clarity. Yeah. Now try to understand once. I will open the Eclipse. So I hope you all installed the Eclipse software in your machines, and then I hope you started to use this Eclipse for developing your Java applications or coding. Okay. So let me launch our workspace where we used to like what save our Java programs. In this, I'm going to prepare one particular constructor so that you will get the clarity whether it is really initializing the object or not. Okay. Let me free Java sessions. This is the project which I have created under default package. Let me try to like what define on any class. Any class you can define. Our ultimate purpose is to define the constructor, right? So student is the class name I wanted to create. Okay. Usually inside the student class, I am going to like what define int stid string st name. Right. So public void display. So system.out.println of student id plus stid, system.out.println of student name plus st name. This is a simple logic, right? So did you initialize the values for this stid and st name? No. We are just declaring the variables, right? And then we are trying to print. Since we did not initialize any values or assign any values, but still you are trying to display some values, right? Okay. So now what I'm doing, define the main method. Without main method, I can't execute the program, right? For example, if you are trying to execute this program without main method, immediately, let me try to like what, right click here, run as here, run as Java application. Are you seeing? No. Why? Because of, if you have a main method, yes, it is possible. Otherwise, it is not possible. Define the main method, and inside this, we have to create the object. Why? Because whatever the properties the variables and the method I am defining, all these are what? Instance properties, non-static properties. So for sure to access these non-static properties from the static area, for sure we require what? Object. So that is the reason I am creating the object. You need to understand why should we go forward creating the object. Just like that, we should not create the object. There is a purpose. Without purpose, uh, if you are creating the variables or objects unnecessarily, it is impacting on top of your performance. Application performance will be degraded. That is why make sure whether it is really required, we should create. Otherwise, we should not go forward that creation. So that is not at all even the standard also. Okay. So after you create the object, now what I have to do is I supposed to access those values system. So since the logic is available inside the display method, you can happily access this obj.display method, meaning that you are calling display method using object name. This one is already you are aware. When I try to run this, control comes to here, student ID, stid you are printing, student name, st name you are printing, but you did not assign any values. So what is the output you are expecting, all of you? I am seeing your chat box. Can anyone guess? I am seeing your chat box. Can anyone guess? What is the output we are expecting? Student ID, student name. I wanted to see the result. Since you are not initializing, but still you are trying to call the display method, am I getting any error or any values or nothing will be displayed? What is your guess? I am just seeing your chat box. Just try to guess it. Even if it is wrong, that's not a problem. Right. So let me try to like what run as Java application. Run as Java application. When I try to run this Java application, you see student ID we are getting 0, student name we are getting null. Okay, meaning is I am not initializing the values like this. I am not initializing the values like this. If I run the application now also, I am getting the same values like 0 and null. But previously you did not initialize the values. But then who initialized the values? Right. See, where you are observing or not, this is the class name, this is the object name, this is the operator, and this is the constructor. But that constructor was not there here in your class. Right. So basically, when you are defining the constructor using this particular default constructor or no arg constructor, automatically, if there is no constructor in your class, automatically that will be created by Java compiler. Whatever the code I am writing, usually, how can we define the constructor? Tell me, how can we define the constructor? Public void student. So tell me, is this a really constructor? No. Why? Because constructor should not return anything, even void also. That is the reason I am removing. But is this is a method? Method name, I mean constructor name and then class name always must be same. But right now, student is S is the small, but here class name S is capital. That is the reason. Make sure constructor name and class name must be same. The moment I am changing from small s to capital S, the error is also getting rectified. And here I am trying to like what initialize the values. So stid equals to 100, st name equals to Rama. Save it. And if I try to run this, now I am getting 100 and then Rama. So now problem is, now the point I wanted to tell you here whatever the constructor you are defining, this is the no argument constructor. Define the or else user defined default constructor. What do you mean by default constructor? It is a constructor which does not take any parameters. If you are not defining by yours, automatically Java compiler will create a Java compiler generates one system defined default constructor. So what it will do, that system defined default constructor will assign the default values based on the data type. If for all the integer category variables default value is 0, for all the float category default data types default value is 0.0, for all the boolean category data types default value is false, For all the character data type, default value is a single space. So like this, based on the data type, okay, it is providing some default values, and those default values will be initialized by whom? System defined default constructor that will be generated by Java compiler. When Java compiler will generate this? When you are not defining any constructor in your class. If you are defining your own constructor, that is fine. It is considering this constructor only. When system defined default constructor will be generated when you are not defining anything inside your class. Automatically this Java compiler will generate this. How? This is the code. So stid equals to 0, stname equals to null. So this is default values will be initialized by this constructor, and this will be generated by Java compiler when you are not defining any constructor. So ultimately, initializing the values is nothing but, don't you feel initializing the object or not? Okay, so majorly we do have two types of constructors are there. Okay, two types of constructors are there. One is default constructor, another one is parameterized constructor. So what do you mean by default constructor, or you can also call it as what? No arg constructor. No args constructor. It is a constructor which doesn't takes any parameters. This is the meaning. Okay, so majorly default constructors are again two types. Okay, so what is this? System defined default constructor. Okay, and the second one is what? User defined default constructor. What is the core purpose of system defined default constructor? It will be generated by Java compiler when we don't define any constructor, inside the class. When we don't define constructors inside the class, this is what we need to understand. It will be generated by Java compiler when we don't define any constructor inside the class. Okay, what is the purpose? So this system defined default constructor's purpose is what? It will initialize, come on, it will initialize the default values based on the data type. For example, integer category data types. Okay, so what is the default value? 0. In the same manner, float category 0.0. Character category, okay, it is something like single space. Okay, for string it should be capital, right? For string it should be null. Okay, for boolean category it should be something like false. You just check it once, and these default values will be initialized by system generated default constructor, and that will be generated when you are not defining any constructors inside your class. Of course, what is the purpose of user defined default constructor? This will be initializing our own values. Programmer, whatever the values which are given by the programmer, those values will be initialized. Okay, that is the purpose of what? User defined default constructor. But here I wanted to tell you one point. Even though when you are defining user defined default constructor, but still, okay, Java compiler first invokes default values, okay, into the object, and later our own values will be replaced. Very important point, will be replaced. So this is the note point. Even though when we are defining our own default constructor to initialize our own values, but first Java compiler is invoking is placing the default values into the object, and later, okay, it will be get some realization. Okay, this programmer defined this user defined default constructor for their own values initialization. Accordingly, the existing default values will be replaced with the new values, meaning that so that is a kind of it takes some little time to place the default values and replace with our own values. It takes some time actually, but To avoid this kind of issue, people will go for what? Parameterized constructor. People will go for what? Parameterized constructor. So what do you mean by parameterized constructor? It is a constructor which doesn't takes any parameters. Which doesn't takes any parameters. Sorry. So it is a constructor which takes parameters based on the requirement. Based on the requirement. When you are defining any parameterized constructor inside your class system, okay, I mean Java compiler will not generate any default constructor. Very, very important point, please note down. When we are defining any parameterized constructor, okay, Java compiler will not generate, okay, will not generate any system defined default constructor. Okay, so this is what we need to understand. I will show you practically also. You may ask one question, so what is the, you may ask one question, what is the difference between parameterized constructor and then user defined default constructor? In case of default constructor, first default values will be replaced. After that, user desired values will be replaced. But in case of parameterized constructor, that placing and replacing things won't be happen. Directly while we are creating the object only, we are passing the values. So these values only will be directly placed into the object. So it is reducing some time, okay, to place or to initialize the object with the values, with our own values in case of parameterized constructor. So ultimately it helps us to improve the performance of the application. Okay. So, but one point I told you, when we are defining any parameterized constructor, system defined default constructor will not be generated by the Java compiler. If you want to maintain both default constructor and then parameterized constructor, that is fine. But system generated default constructor will not be generated. That is what exactly I wanted to convey. So now coming back to here, okay, since here I wanted to define now public student int stid, okay, string st name, or else int x comma string y. So let me, obviously this is a constructor, but this constructor is taking two parameters of integer type and then string type. It is depending on our requirement. It is not mandatory to maintain both int and then string always. It depends on the requirement we are defining. Okay, so now this is what type of constructor? Tell me. User defined parameterized constructor. To be honest, it is what kind of constructor? Double parameterized constructor, since two parameters are there. Okay, so now I am, see sir, immediately when I maximize this code right now inside, okay, 1 second. Okay, I'm just commenting. You try to let me try to remove this. Control A, Control C. I'm taking the backup. Okay, up to here. Example of this default constructor I'm giving after the parameterized constructor. You also try to match it. Let me try to remove this now. Okay, otherwise you people will get confused. So now there is nothing is there. Now I wanted to define parameterized constructor. So whenever, now so far I am not getting any error to create the object. Now you created the object using which constructor? Default constructor. Did you define any constructor? No constructors. Even though if you are not defining any constructors, system will automatically generate one default constructor. That is the reason we are not getting any error, even though when you create the object using this default constructor. That is hidden actually. But when we define the parameterized constructor, system defined default constructor will not be generated by the Java compiler. Practically we will see now public student, okay, of int x comma string y. So what kind of parameterized constructor it is? It is a double parameterized constructor, since it is taking two parameters. The moment when you are creating, automatically here the error 20 line number 22, it is giving you the issue because the constructor student is undefined. Whenever you are creating this constructor using this default constructor, that is there or not there? That is not there. But now this time Java compiler will generate that. No, why? Because of you define the parameterized constructor. So that is the reason you have to create the object by using this default parameter, sorry, double parameterized constructor. Otherwise you are getting this compile time error. If you wanted to create the object by using this double parameterized constructor while we are creating the object, it is expecting integer, first argument as integer type, second argument as string type. So accordingly you have to pass. For example, 100 I am passing. Okay, 100 is of integer type. Rama is I am passing. So 100 is expecting as a student ID. Rama is expecting as a student name. So this 100 will go and then storing inside the X. Rama will come and then store inside the Y. So am I able to like what access this X and Y? You please tell me, all of you. X and Y, am I able to access inside the display method? No. Why? Because of X and Y you are declaring inside the constructor. So the scope is only within this method, within this constructor. But you are trying to access outside of the method, outside of the constructor, that is display. But what we have to do, when it is possible, this when you are able to see already stid and st name is there, these are the class level variables. If you are passing the value of x, value of y into these two properties, I am able to like what access throughout the class. I am able to access throughout the class. So that is the reason what kind of logic I am passing here. stid equal to x, st name equals to y, meaning is whatever the value it got stored inside the x, and that is getting transferred into stid. So now the 100 is available inside the stid. So happily you can't access local variables, but you can access class level variables throughout the class. So stid and then st name you can able to access. Okay, I hope you understand the logic behind this double parameterizer constructor. So when you try to run this, automatically we are getting student ID and then student name we are getting. So meaning that here also we are initializing double parameterizer constructor, also we are initializing the object only. Initializing the object is nothing but initializing the values to the properties of the class. That is what we need to understand. Right. So one more point I wanted to add here. There might be a chance. For example, I'll tell you later. But here, if you really wanted to create the object through the parameterizer constructor, how many number of times you can pass the different values? Those many number of times it is giving you the values. For example, student, one more object I am creating, obj1 equals to new student. Here I am passing different values. For example, here obj1 dot display, save it. I am creating one more object with new values, and then I am calling display method. When I am trying to run this, student ID 100 Rama, student 101, and then Benny. So like this, how many number of times you create the object, those many number of times the corresponding constructor will be invoked. We no need to invoke the method. You no need to invoke the constructor specially. See, the same thing here, the logic is available inside the display method. When this logic will be executed, when you call it, if you are not calling, what will happen? That logic will be executed or will not be executed? It will not be executed. But whatever the logic inside the constructor, do you really calling that particular constructor? No, we are not calling. When it is calling, the moment when you create the object, automatically control goes to that constructor and the logic will be executed. So my final conclusion point is what? Okay, whenever we create the object, automatically corresponding constructors will get invoked. Okay, how many number of times you create the object, those many number of times the corresponding constructors will be invoked. So this is point you need to understand. Okay, so after this, let me try to control C. Okay, example I'm giving regarding this parameterizer constructor. Parameterizer constructor, you can define as many constructor as you want. One more question, sir, you define the parameterizer constructor, but I wanted to define my own user defined default constructor also. So is it possible to like what keep the both default constructor and parameterizer constructor also? Yes, of course it is there. We don't have any restrictions. Okay, you can define the constructor as usual. Default constructor also you can define. What is the purpose of default constructor? stid equals to define I mean, since it is a user defined, you can pass your own values. For example, 102 st name equals to Bhaskar. Let me save this. Okay, so this is what user defined default constructor. User defined default constructor. And this is user defined what? Of course, always parameter constructors are user defined only. We don't need to specify. So why we have to specify in case of default constructor? Because of there might be a existing of a chance of existing. One is system defined default constructor and user defined. That is the reason particularly I am specifying this double parameter constructor here. It is there, and this is the logic. Now if I am executing this, again we are getting these two constructors only. One is I mean this constructor will be executed 2 times. But what about this constructor? If I wanted to execute or access this constructor, what we have to do? Again, we have to create one more object. How can you create the one more object? Student obj2 equals to new. You are going to create the object with respect to default constructor or parameterizer constructor. We have to like what create the object using default constructor. So then control goes to the student. Sorry, this one, and the values will be initialized. And now what we have to do after initializing, for the display purpose, you have to call which method? Display method. Using which object? This obj2 itself. obj2 dot display method. Save it. Now am I getting Bhaskar and then one or two or not? Yes. Along with this parameterizer constructors, okay, this default constructor data also gets invoked since you call the display method. So ultimately, the core purpose of defining the constructors, I have two usages I am observing. One is, what is that? Tell me, what are the advantages of defining constructors? Advantages of defining constructor. Yeah, can anyone tell me? In case of constructors, we no need to invoke. Okay, we no need to invoke explicitly. Okay, the moment you create the object, the moment we create the objects, respective, or else the moment we create the object, corresponding constructors will get invoked. So, but in case of methods, normal methods, if you wanted to execute those logic of the methods, definitely you have to explicitly we have to call, otherwise that logic won't be executed. But in case of constructors, that logic always gets executed whenever you create the object. That is one thing you need to understand. Okay, and one more purpose, the whole purpose, core purpose of the constructor is what? It is used to initialize the object. Okay, 99.99% we have to use the constructors for the initialization purpose only, like this. Initialization purpose only we have to use. You can write some other logic also inside the constructor for displaying purpose, for some other calculations purpose we can use, but that is not at all the standard. So we have to define the constructors only for initialization. Initialization means what? Assigning the values. What is the main difference between default constructor and parameterizer constructor? That is also one important question. Difference between come on, default constructor and parameterizer constructor. First difference is what? Default constructors won't take any parameters, whereas parameterizer constructor is taking some parameters based on the requirement. That is the main difference. Purpose wise, what is the difference? In case of default constructor, come on please, in case of default constructor, in case of default constructors, okay, first compiler places the default values into object, and later the values will be replaced, our own values, and later our values will be replaced into the object. So this is what is happening in case of user defined default constructor. In case of just a predefined or system defined default constructor, only compiler will places the default values. That's it. But in case of user defined default constructor, even though when you have a user defined default constructor, first compiler places the default values into object, and later those values will be replaced with our own values. That is the mechanism. This is the mechanism what they have designed. And in case of parameterizer constructor, directly our own values will be replaced. Sorry, our own values will be placed into an object. Okay, in case of parameterized constructor, there is no case of placing the default values and again replacing with our own values, not like that. So because of this mechanism, what is happening comparatively, parameterized constructors performance is a little bit more than default constructors. So that is what we need to understand. That is the difference between default constructor and parameterized constructor. Okay. And now one more point. For example, in my class, I have 1,000 constructors are there. 1,000 constructors are there. Okay. So now I wanted to execute all 1,000 constructors. How many number of times we have to create the object? When you have a something like scenario, if I have 1,000 constructors are there in my class, okay, where each and every constructor has having their own initialization logic. You wanted to like what execute all these 1,000 constructors logic. How many number of times we have to create the object? Just now I told you object, I mean constructor logic will always executed whenever you create the object. In the same manner, when you have a class with many number of constructors, more than 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, we have more than like 100 or 1,000 constructors are there. To execute these 1,000 constructors, definitely we need to like what create a 1,000 times object. 1,000 times object creation is required to access those 1,000 constructors logic. But to access the 1,000 constructors logic, creating the object for 1,000 number of times is the worst kind of programming practice. So immediately, what is the alternative? Immediately we have to think about what alternative process. Meaning that I don't want to create the object for those many number of times. I wanted to create the object for only one time, but only with one time, one object, I wanted to execute with only one object, I wanted to execute all the constructors of the class. Is it possible or not possible? Of course, it is possible. So by using which keyword it is possible? By using which keyword it is possible? This keyword it is possible. This is the syntax. This is the syntax. And before the syntax, we do have one more concept is there. That is what this. So here first let me discuss about what first this and then this open parenthesis and then close parenthesis. Right. So this is the Java reserved keyword. Okay, this is the Java reserved keyword. Why we are using? For example, let me try to like what remove this user defined default constructors. Or else, if you want, you can keep it. Not a problem. Okay, just now you just observe here. I have one constructor. I have two constructors are there. How many number of times you have created the object? How many number of times you have created the object to access this two constructors? Two objects are required. Two objects are required, right? Because of two constructors, two times object supposed to be created, then accordingly those two constructors will be executed. What if I have 1,000 constructors? Definitely we have to create the 1,000 times object. That I will show you. But now one point whether you are observing or not, first while you are creating the object using this parameterized constructor, you are passing this 100 and then Rama. So this 100 and then Rama will go and then store inside the X and then Y. These are the local variables of this constructor. And we are assigning these local values to the class level variables and we are accessing outside of the constructor also. But there might be a chance because we are not stopping the programmers, right? Because if I'm defining these parameters also like this, so what is happening here? You are defining the constructor level parameters also same as what class level variables. If that is the case, how can you assign the values? stid equals to stid, stname equals to stname. So which stid is the class level variable, which stid is the constructor level parameter? As a human being, we can understand. Okay, left hand side variable is class level variable, and right hand side variable is constructor level parameter. Since always the value will be assigned from right to left. As a human being, we can understand. But how Java compiler can identified or identified this, which one is the class level variable, which one is the constructor level variable. So to identify it by the Java compiler, you have to always use this keyword before the class level variable. So that is the reason this is representing always class level properties. Class level properties means what? A current object. Class level properties means a current class object. When you are proceeding anything with this, that is this particular variable or property is considering as what? Current class object. Am I clear about this? Am I clear about this? I hope I am clear about this keyword usage, first usage. So what is the first usage? Tell me. Whenever, come on, whenever we declare, okay, class level variables and constructor level parameters are both same. Constructor level parameters both are same. Okay, to differentiate, we have to use this keyword. We have to use this keyword before class level variables. I hope you understand. So example also just now I showed you, so that the same example I'm just copying, same example but little changes with respect to the concept. So if you're understanding that, that is fine. Okay, so this is the example. Save it. So here you just observe my constructor level variables, my class level variables are same. To differentiate this, we are using this keyword. So whatever the property which is preceded with this, this is representing the class level variables, right? So since student ID right now, this dot stid inside this dot st name, let me save this and I try to run this. I'm getting the output like this. So because of the values are available into the left hand side variable. What is the left hand side variable? This dot stid, even this dot stname. Sir, whether you are believing or not, even though if you are not using this, always our variables are preceded with this keyword only. So that is the reason, even though if you are not using this keyword, it is giving you the actual data only, because of always the current class properties are preceded with what? This keyword only. That is happening by default. Itself. And one more point I wanted to ask or tell you, the advantage. What is one more advantage is there, right? What is that one more advantage of this keyword? This is the syntax. So this is the Java reserved keyword. Okay, here, okay, let me do one thing. Let me cut this. Before this example only, I wanted to give you this information. Okay, information. This is the, okay, I already noted down. This ones. This keyword in Java. Right. This is the information, theoretical information about this, and followed by practical example we have seen. And one more syntax is there to use this. As I said, when we have multiple constructors inside our application, to access or to execute all these constructors, we have to create the objects also with the same number. But creating the objects for those many number of times just to access the corresponding constructors is not at all a good kind of programming practice. To avoid this issue, we are using this particular syntax. Okay, so you just observe here. Right now I have a one user defined default constructor, one parameterizer constructor. To access these two objects I have created, but I don't want to create the object like this. Okay, just to create the object here, since we have a parameterizer constructor and as well as what default constructor is there, you can create the object either by using default constructor or either by using parameterizer constructor. It's up to you. We don't have any restrictions. We don't have any restrictions. It's up to your wish. You may create the object by using parameterizer constructor, or you may create the object by using either default constructor. It's your wish. So now the point is here. Okay. So for example, I wanted to create the object by using default constructor. Student obj equals to new student. I am not passing any parameters. So immediately control goes to which constructor? Default constructor of my current class. Control comes to here. Okay. Once control comes to here, I wanted to, for example, if I run this, okay, obj.display, obj.display, okay, obj.display. When I'm run this, only one constructor, that too user defined default constructors gets executed. But now what is my requirement? Just by creating the object only for once, I wanted to access all the constructors logic. That is why once you created the object using this default constructor, control comes to here, and from here what I wanted to do is I wanted to call the current class, I mean student class. Which constructor you have to call? Parameterizer constructor. Using what? This syntax. Okay, here two syntaxes are there. One is this open parenthesis and then close the parenthesis. What do you mean by this? It is used to call current class default constructor. Okay, so one more syntax is there. You can pass parameters. It is used to call current class parameterizer constructor. For example, if you are passing one parameter, it will call one single parameterizer constructor. If you are passing two, it will call double parameterizer constructor. Like that, based on the constructors availability, we have to pass parameters accordingly. Okay, now coming back to here, since we do have only two double parameterizer constructor, I have to use this of open parenthesis and close parenthesis. It is accepting student ID is of which type? Integer type. Student name is of string type. So here 101 and then followed by Rama. I am passing the integer value and then string value. So then control goes to where? From here, the moment you create the object using this default constructor, control goes to this default constructor, and immediately control is transferring from here, from the default constructor to double parameter constructor of the current class. What we are doing here? You are assigning this dot stid equals to stid, and again this dot stname equals to stname itself, and again you are calling display method only. So now here if I'm calling this, again student ID 102, student name Bhaskar, only one time only. See, you are just invoking the constructors, but the logic is available. Values will be initialized into the constructor, but where exactly you are displaying? Into the display method, itself. So that is why what I have to do is, usually we can keep it in like SOP method, but to avoid this issue, since I'm not able to see the output, what I have to do is, once the values will be initialized, control comes to here, and from here if I wanted to call the display method, I can use this. Yes, I can use this display method. This is always representing current class object. Okay, so if I run this application now, so you see student ID 101 Rama, student ID 102 Bhaskar. So why we have to call? See, whenever you call this current class parameterizer constructor using this particular syntax, control goes to this constructor, values will be initialized. Once values will be initialized, control comes back. Whatever the values are getting initialized by the constructor, I wanted to display. So where exactly that display logic you wrote? Inside the display method. So how the control will go to again display method? Since you are in constructor, you can call that non-static method using object. Always this is representing current class object. That is the reason I am using this dot display. So then again control goes to display method with whatever the values got initialized, and those will be displayed. And again control comes back, and this since you are in user defined default constructor, stid 102 Bhaskar will be initialized, and again control comes back to the main method, and since you are calling the display method, control goes back to the display method, and the values what initialized with this 102 Bhaskar, that is will be coming itself. So this much control flow is going to be happening itself. But once you understand how it is happening, it's very clear understanding. Okay, so this is very important actually. Constructors concept is very important. People are not aware how exactly the basic constructors purpose also people used to like what forget. So try to understand the core purpose of constructors instead of see I can just simply write one SOP statement and then I can show you, but that is not the way actually to show the constructors concept. Along with the examples, if I can show you the purpose of the constructors, how in real time also we are using, then you will get more clarity. That is all my intention. Okay, so let me copy this example and coming back to here. Yep, example, and then here few complexes are there, few things are there. What those few things? Since you created the object using default constructor, control goes to the default constructor. Again you are calling the parameter constructor. Again coming back here, if I am trying to call again default constructor, immediately you are getting the error. What is this error? Tell me. Recursive constructor invocation student, meaning that now your control goes to here. Okay, and then you are calling this, and again if you are calling this, when this cycle will be end, from the default constructor you are calling parameter constructor, from the parameter constructor you are trying to call default constructor. When this cycle will end, we have to end somewhere, na? If the cycle will not end, what will happen? You will get the compile time error saying that recursive constructor invocation is not at all possible. You have to end cycle somewhere. If you are not ending, it is giving you the error saying that recursive constructor error. This is one thing you need to understand. Okay, so note point I am writing. Note point we have to write while we are calling or invoking the current class constructors. Okay, somewhere in some constructors we have to end this invocation we have to stop somewhere. We have to stop in somewhere means what? In some constructor. Okay, so otherwise we will get, okay, we will get compile time error. Saying that recursive constructor invocation is not possible. You have to end the cycle somewhere. And one more note point I wanted to tell you regarding the constructors. What is that? Constructor calling always must be the first executable statement. Otherwise we will get compile time error. I will show you just now. Okay, I will show you. Just wait. Okay, so you call the constructor, control goes to this default constructor, and immediately you are calling this. For example, if you are not calling this, after somewhere if you are calling, immediately we are getting this error. I mean, what is saying? Constructor call must be the first statement in a constructor. If you really wanted to invoke any other constructor from any other constructor, it should be always must be the first executable statement. Otherwise we will get the compile time error saying that constructor call must be the first statement. Okay, this is also the point we need to understand. Whatever the example I told you, this is an example for what? Constructor chaining. Okay, from one constructor, if you want to call one more constructor, that is the concept of what? Constructor chaining. Example of what? Constructor chaining. In case of constructor chaining, we have to follow two things. One is you have to call the constructor, and that statement must be the first executable statement. And the second important point is, okay, and the second important point is you have to invoke the, you have to stop the invocation in some constructor. Otherwise, keep on it is calling from one constructor to another constructor, from this constructor to that constructor. If keep on it is calling, cycle should not end. If cycle should not end, compile time error saying that recursive constructor invocation is not at all possible. So these are all the points which we had a great discussion on top of the constructors and its types, and how compiler will generate the system defined default constructor, and what is the purpose of system defined default constructor, what is the purpose of user defined default constructors, categorize wise, data types wise, what are the default values. All these things are about what constructors. So whole purpose of constructor is to initialize the object. Initializing the object is nothing but initializing the values of the class properties. That is about what constructors itself. Okay, so